Elderly woman leaves prison after 26 years wrongfully imprisoned, but who was waiting for her changes everything. Margaret Foster walked slowly through the gates of the Women's Correctional Facility of Riverside, carrying only a faded plastic bag with her few belongings. At 68, her grey hair bore the marks of 26 long years behind bars, convicted for a fire she had always sworn she didn't cause. Outside, an elegant man in a dark suit waited beside a gleaming helicopter. Brandon Mitchell smiled with open arms, but Margaret couldn't recognize that face. How did someone she didn't know exactly when she would be released? "Mrs. Margaret Foster?" the man asked, approaching. She stopped, holding her bag tightly and studying the stranger with suspicion. 26 years in prison had taught her to be wary of people who seemed overly kind. "Who wants to know?" she replied with a hoarse voice. Years without much conversation had left her vocal cords rusty. "My name is Brandon Mitchell. I know you don't know me, but I've known you since I was a child." He moved closer, keeping his hands visible so as not to scare her. "I came to get you because I have something very important to tell you." Margaret studied the man carefully. He must have been in his early 40s, well-dressed, with an expensive watch on his wrist and Italian shoes she had learned to recognize by watching the lawyers who passed through the prison. The helicopter behind him indicated he wasn't just anyone. "What do you want from me?" she asked, taking a step back. "I want to help you. I know you have nowhere to go. I know your house was sold while you were in prison." Brandon spoke kindly, but Margaret noticed something strange in his eyes. "I've reserved a hotel room for you, for as long as you need." "Why? No one does that without wanting something in return." Brandon took a deep breath, as if gathering courage for a difficult confession. "Because I was there that night, at your daycare fire." The words hit Margaret like a punch to the stomach. Her legs almost gave way, and she had to lean against the prison wall. All these years, she had wondered about the children she cared for that terrible night. What had happened to them? How were they? Had they fully recovered from their injuries? You were one of the children," she murmured, her voice almost inaudible. "I was 7. My mother would leave me at your daycare some afternoons a week because she worked 2 jobs. Brandon moved closer slowly. "Mrs. Margaret, I remember everything about that night, and I know you didn't cause that fire." Tears began to stream down Margaret's aged face. For 26 years she had screamed her innocence to anyone who would listen. Lawyers, judges, other inmates, psychologists, social workers, they all looked at her with pity or disbelief. And now, here was someone who could confirm what she had always known. "Why did you never say anything? Why did you let me rot in prison all these years?" Anger began to mix with emotion. "I was just a child. After the fire, my mother forbade me from talking about that night. She said it would be better to forget everything." Brandon lowered his eyes. "But I never forgot. And when I grew up and found out you were still in prison, I decided I needed to do something." Margaret wiped her tears with the back of her hand. Life in prison had made her a strong woman, but that revelation was shaking all the defenses she had built over the years. "What do you want from me now? That I forgive and forget everything?" "No. I want to help you prove your innocence. I want the world to know the truth about what happened that night." Brandon extended his hand. "But first, let me take you somewhere you can clean up, have a decent meal, and rest. Then we'll talk about everything." Margaret looked at the outstretched hand, then at the helicopter, and again at the face of the man who claimed to have been one of her children. Part of her wanted to trust, but another part, shaped by years of suffering, screamed to be careful. "How do I know you're telling the truth? How do I know this isn't some kind of scam?" Brandon took a wallet from his suit jacket's inner pocket and showed an old photograph. It was a small child with dark hair and a gap-toothed smile, next to a younger woman in a nurse's uniform. "This is my mother, Jennifer Mitchell. She worked at St. Catherine Medical Center at the time. And this is me, Brandon, the boy who always asked you to tell the story of the ugly duckling at snack time." Margaret's heart raced. She remembered Brandon, a shy, polite boy who always said please and thank you. How could she have forgotten those big, curious eyes? "Brady," she murmured, using the affectionate nickname from when he was little. "It's me, Aunt Margaret." He smiled, and for a moment she could see the 7-year-old boy she used to care for. "Come with me. We have a lot to talk about." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like the video and especially to subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. Margaret accepted the outstretched hand and walked toward the helicopter. The pilot, a middle-aged man in an impeccable uniform, greeted them respectfully and helped Margaret board the aircraft. It was her first time flying, and the feeling of leaving the ground was both frightening and liberating. As they flew over the city of Los Angeles, Margaret watched from the window the changes that 26 years had brought. New buildings, roads that didn't exist before, entire neighborhoods that had sprung up. It was like waking up in a different world. "A lot has changed, hasn't it?" Brandon commented, noticing her expression. "Everything has changed," she replied softly, "except my truth." The hotel where Brandon took her was in an elegant West Side neighborhood of Los Angeles. The room was simple but comfortable, with a double bed, a flat-screen TV, and a private bathroom. Luxuries Margaret had forgotten existed. "Rest a bit. Whenever you're ready, we can have dinner and talk," Brandon said before leaving. Alone in the room, Margaret looked at herself in the bathroom mirror. The face staring back was a stranger's, deep wrinkles, completely grey hair, eyes that had seen much pain. She turned on the faucet and let the hot water run through her fingers, something she hadn't done in decades. The shower was an almost spiritual experience. Hot water, perfumed soap, shampoo that lathered. She stayed under the shower for almost an hour, as if she could wash away not just the dirt, but also some of the accumulated suffering. When she went down to the hotel restaurant, Brandon was already waiting for her at a reserved table. He had changed from his suit into more casual clothes, but still maintained an air of prosperity. "How are you feeling?" he asked as she sat down. "Lost," she answered honestly. 26 years is a long time. I don't know how to live outside those bars anymore." "I understand. It must be very difficult indeed." He signaled to the waiter. "How about we order something good?" "When was the last time you had a real meal?" Margaret couldn't remember. In prison, the food was basic and bland. They ordered simple but flavorful dishes, and she ate slowly, savoring every bite. "Tell me about that night," Brandon said after they finished eating. "What do you remember?" Margaret took a deep breath. It was a story she had told thousands of times, but it had never lost its pain in the telling. It was a rainy Tuesday in August. There were 8 children at the daycare that night because some mothers were working late. She closed her eyes, as if she could see the scene. "You were all in the living room watching cartoons after dinner. I was in the kitchen washing the dishes when I smelled something burning." "Go on." Brandon Mitchell leaned forward, paying attention to every word. "When I left the kitchen, I saw smoke coming from the room where we kept the cleaning supplies. I ran to get you all. I took each child out of the house one by one and placed them outside, in the rain." The tears began to stream again. "You were crying because you wanted your stuffed teddy bear that was left inside." "I remember that," said Brandon softly. "When I realized the fire was spreading, I ran to call the fire department from the neighbor's phone. When I came back, 3 children had gone back inside after their toys." Margaret needed to stop to breathe. "I managed to get 2 out, but you and little Anna were trapped in the back room. How did we get out?" "I broke the window with a chair and pulled you both out by your arms. You were coughing a lot from the smoke, but you were alive." She wiped her eyes. "The firefighters arrived 15 minutes later. Everyone was taken to the hospital. I thought everyone was going to be okay. And we were. Anna had some burns on her arm. I inhaled a lot of smoke, but we recovered completely." "Then why did they convict you?" The question was heavy with years of anguish. Brandon hesitated before answering. "Because they found evidence that the fire was arson, and you were the only adult on site." "But I didn't do anything. You were there. You saw how I risked myself to save all the children." "I know that. But at the time, no one wanted to listen to the testimony of a traumatized 7-year-old. Margaret rested her head in her hands. The injustice of it all still made her furious. even after so many years. "Margaret, can I ask you a question?" said Brandon gently. "You may. Do you remember seeing any strange person hanging around the daycare in the days before the fire?" She lifted her head, surprised by the question. "Why do you want to know that?" "Because after I grew up, I started researching that night, and I discovered some things that don't add up." "What kind of things?" Brandon looked around the restaurant as if wanting to make sure no one was listening. The official report said the fire started due to a problem with the electrical wiring in the supply room, but I clearly remember seeing you check all the outlets that afternoon because one of them was making a strange noise. Margaret's heart began to beat faster. She really had checked the outlets that afternoon because the one behind the cleaning products shelf was making noise. "You remember that?" "I remember perfectly. And I remember you saying you were going to call an electrician the next day to check it." Brandon leaned further forward. "But according to the report, the fire was caused by negligence in electrical maintenance." "That doesn't make sense. I always took very good care of everything at the daycare." "Exactly. That's why I started to suspect there was something wrong with the investigation." Margaret felt a mix of hope and fear. Could there still be a chance to clear her name after all these years? "What did you find out?" "That the company responsible for the electrical installation at your daycare was the same one that did the work at 3 other establishments that caught fire in the same month. All were considered accidents or owner negligence." "How did you find that out?" Brandon smiled for the first time since they had met. "Because I'm a lawyer, and when I graduated, I decided to investigate your case as my first cause." The revelation left Margaret speechless. "During all those years in prison, someone was working to prove your innocence." "Are you a lawyer?" she asked, still processing the information. "I graduated 15 years ago. I mainly work on medical malpractice and civil liability cases." He paused. "But your case has always been my priority." "Why did you never try to contact me before?" "I did try. I attempted to visit you at the correctional facility several times, but you refused all visits. The administration said you didn't want to see anyone." Margaret remembered the visitation requests she had rejected over the years. After the first years of dashed hope, she had decided to sever all ties with the outside world. It was less painful to have no expectations. "I thought they were journalists or curiosity seekers," she admitted. "I understand. But I never gave up. I kept investigating, gathering evidence, looking for witnesses." Brandon took a folder from the bag at his feet. "I want to show you what I found." They went up to Margaret's room where Brandon spread documents on the bed. There were copies of reports, photographs of the fire scene, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes. "Look at this." He pointed to a photo of the damaged electrical wiring. "This outlet, where the fire supposedly started, was installed just 2 weeks before the incident." "What do you mean?" "Do you remember requesting any electrical work during that period?" Margaret studied the photo carefully. The outlet was in a position she didn't recall. "No, I never asked to install a new outlet there." She touched the photo with her finger. "This outlet didn't even exist when I left the daycare that morning." "That's exactly what I suspected." Brandon picked up another document. "The company St. Patrick Electric did the installation the day before the fire. But there's no record of you hiring that service." "So who hired them?" "That's the million-dollar question." He showed more papers. St. Patrick Electric closed 3 months after the fire. The owner, Richard Thompson, moved to the countryside and was never found again. Margaret felt the world spinning around her. It was becoming clear that she had been the victim of an elaborate setup. "But why? Why would anyone do this to me?" "I don't have all the answers yet, but I believe it has to do with the land where your daycare was." "The land?" Brandon took an official document from the folder. "Your land was sold for a pittance 6 months after you were imprisoned. The buyer was an urban development company called Skyline Construction." "I've never heard of that company." "Because it didn't exist until a week before it bought your land." He showed the company's incorporation documents. "And it was dissolved 1 month after the purchase." "That's very strange. Even stranger is the fact that the land was resold for 10 times the purchase price to a major developer 6 months later." Margaret was beginning to understand the scale of the conspiracy against her. Someone had carefully planned everything to force her to sell the land for almost nothing. "Who owned Skyline Construction?" "2 partners. One died in a car accident 2 years later. The other—" Brandon hesitated. "The other what?" "The other is Richard Harrington. Today he owns one of the largest construction companies in Los Angeles." The name meant nothing to Margaret, but she could see from Brandon's expression that it was important. "Who is Richard Harrington?" "One of the richest and most influential men in the city, owner of malls, commercial buildings, luxury condominiums." Brandon put the papers back in the folder. "And the man who destroyed your life to make a few million." The anger Margaret had learned to control during her years in prison began to boil again. Someone had stolen 26 years of her life for money. "What do we do now?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're going to prove you're innocent and that you were the victim of a conspiracy." Brandon took her hand. "But we need to be very careful. Harrington has a lot of power and influence. It won't be easy to face him." "I don't care if it's easy or hard," said Margaret with determination. "I want my dignity back." Brandon smiled, seeing the strength she still had after so many years of suffering. "Then let's start tomorrow. First, we'll go to the site of the old daycare. Then we'll look for people who can testify in your favor." "What happened to the other families?" "The children I took care of. Some moved away from the city. Others—" He hesitated again. "Others received generous settlements to not question the official version of events. Harrington paid them to stay quiet? I don't have proof of that yet, but I have my suspicions." Margaret stood up and walked to the bedroom window. Down below, the city continued its normal life. People coming and going, working, living their routines. To all of them, she was just another ex-convict trying to readjust. No one knew about the injustice she had suffered. "Brandon, can I ask you a personal question?" "Of course." "Why did you do this? Why did you spend 15 years of your life investigating a case that wasn't even yours?" Brandon joined her at the window, and they stood in silence for a few moments. "Because you saved my life that night," he said finally. "And because my mother always taught me that when someone does something good for you, you have an obligation to return the favor." "Is your mother still alive?" "She died 5 years ago, cancer." His voice cracked. "But before she passed, she told me something she had never told me before." "What?" "That on the night of the fire, when she arrived at the hospital to pick me up, you were there too. Even injured and in shock, you had insisted on accompanying all the children to the hospital to make sure they were okay." Margaret vaguely remembered that night. After all the commotion with the firefighters and the ambulance, she had indeed gone to the hospital. She wanted to make sure all her children were getting the necessary care. "My mother said you stayed in the waiting room all night, even when the doctors said you could go home." Brandon wiped away a tear. "She said a person who loved children that way would never do anything to hurt them." "I really loved all of you," murmured Margaret. "You were like my own children. That's why I could never accept your conviction, and that's why I'll fight to the end to clear your name." They talked late into the night, planning the next steps. Brandon had prepared a detailed strategy to gather evidence and witnesses. The first step would be to revisit the site of the old daycare, which was now abandoned. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out now continuing. The next morning, they left early for the East Village neighborhood, where Margaret's old daycare was located. The area had changed a lot in 26 years. Where there were once simple houses and dirt roads, now stood apartment buildings and commercial establishments. "It's so different," commented Margaret as they walked down the main street. "The real estate development here was very intense in the last decade," explained Brandon. "Many of the buildings are from Harrington Properties." They turned onto a side street and Margaret stopped abruptly. In front of her was the skeleton of her old home where the daycare had operated. The walls were standing, but the roof had collapsed long ago. Weeds grew through the broken windows and trash accumulated in the corners. "My God," she murmured, bringing a hand to her chest. "Can you go in? Or would you prefer we come back another day?" "No, I need to go in." She took a deep breath and walked toward what remained of the front door. The inside of the house was unrecognizable. Rubble, weeds, and debris covered what had once been her cozy living room. Margaret walked slowly, trying to orient herself by the few landmarks that remained. That was the kitchen. She pointed to a corner where the original tiles could still be seen. And over there, the bedroom where you kids slept when you stayed over. Brandon followed her in silence, respecting this moment of painful reunion with the past. When they reached the back of the house, where the storage room where the fire had started was located, Margaret crouched down and began removing some debris. "What are you looking for?" asked Brandon. "The outlet. I want to see exactly where this outlet they said caused the fire was." They dug for a few minutes until they found traces of the wall where the electrical wiring had been. Margaret studied the wreckage carefully. "Brandon, this doesn't make sense." "What?" "This wall." She touched the charred bricks. "The fire burned from the inside out, not from the outside in." "What do you mean?" "If the fire had started from a problem with the outlet, like they said, the fire would have spread from the wall toward the center of the room." She pointed to the soot marks. "But look at these marks. The fire started in the center of the room and spread to the walls." Brandon crouched down to examine it more closely. Even though he wasn't an expert, he could see the burn marks really did suggest the fire had started in the middle of the space. "Do you think someone set it on fire intentionally?" "I'm sure of it," said Margaret with conviction. "And I think I know how." "How?" "Flammable liquid spilled in the center of the room, probably gasoline or alcohol." She stood up and wiped her hands on her pants. "The fire was set here in the center and then spread to the walls. Whoever did this knew I always checked the electrical installations, so they created a faulty outlet to serve as an alibi." Brandon took out his phone and began photographing the evidence Margaret had pointed out. "This changes everything. If we can prove the fire was arson and had nothing to do with your negligence, we can reopen the case." "But it's been 26 years. Is the evidence still valid?" "Yes, it is, especially if we can correlate it with the documents I already have about the company that did the electrical work." They continued exploring the wreckage when they heard footsteps approaching. An elderly woman appeared at the entrance of the destroyed house. "Excuse me, are you looking for something?" she asked, clearly suspicious. Margaret turned and immediately recognized the woman's face. "Mrs. Evelyn." "Are you Mrs. Evelyn, my old neighbor?" The woman studied Margaret for a few seconds before her eyes widened in surprise. "Margaret? Margaret Foster? Good heavens, it really is you." They hugged emotionally. Mrs. Evelyn had been one of the few people who had defended Margaret during the trial, insisting she would never harm a child. "When did you get out of prison?" asked Mrs. Evelyn, still holding Margaret's hands. "Yesterday. I just finished serving my full sentence." "What a terrible injustice. I always knew you were innocent." She looked at Brandon. "And who is this young man?" "Brandon Mitchell. He was one of the children who attended Margaret's daycare." "Brady? Little Carla's son?" Mrs. Evelyn smiled. "My goodness, you've grown so much. Now I understand why your face looked familiar." "Do you still live here in the neighborhood?" asked Brandon. "I live in the same house as always, right there on the corner," she pointed. "I never wanted to move. All my memories are here." "Mrs. Evelyn, do you remember anything strange that happened in the days before the fire?" asked Margaret. The elderly woman thought for a few moments. "Strange how?" "Unfamiliar people hanging around the house, work that was done without me asking for it, anything out of the ordinary." "Oh, yes," exclaimed Mrs. Evelyn. "I do remember. 2 days before the fire, I saw some men working on the electrical part of your house. I thought you had called them." Margaret's heart raced. "What men? Did you know them?" "I had never seen them before." "There were 2, one older and one younger. They arrived in a white van in the morning and were there working until late afternoon." "Do you remember any detail about the van? The name of any company?" "I remember there was a name written on the side, but my eyesight wasn't very good back then," she thought again. "Wait, there was a word that started with electric that I'm sure of." Brandon and Margaret exchanged glances. It was more evidence that St. Patrick Electric had been at the location before the fire. "Mrs. Evelyn, did anyone else see these men?" asked Brandon. "Mr. Emmanuel, who lived in the blue house right over there, mentioned to me that he thought it was strange there was electrical work at Margaret's house because she always took such good care of everything. Where is Mr. Emmanuel now? He died 10 years ago, poor man, sighed Mrs. Evelyn. But his daughter Susan still lives nearby. She might have seen something too. They spent the afternoon talking with old neighbours. Some had moved away, others had passed on, but those who were still there confirmed seeing strange activity at Margaret's house in the days before the fire. Mr. Emmanuel's daughter, Susan, specifically remembered seeing the men working on the electrical part. I thought it was strange at the time, she told them, because Margaret always gave notice when she was going to have work done on the house. She was very careful about those things, always asked the neighbours' opinions about the professionals she hired. And this time, she didn't say anything, asked Brandon. Nothing. And when I asked her the next day, she said she hadn't called any electrician. Susan paused. Actually, she was even worried because she thought someone might have tampered with the installation without permission. Did she ever check if something was wrong? She said she was going to call a trusted electrician to take a look the next day. Susan lowered her eyes. But then the fire happened before she could do that. It was as if the pieces of a puzzle were finally fitting together. Margaret felt a mix of anger and relief. Anger at discovering the extent of the conspiracy against her, and relief at finally having evidence of her innocence. When they returned to the hotel in the late afternoon, Brandon was excited about the day's discoveries. "Margaret, this is much better than I expected," he said while organizing the notes he had taken. "We have witnesses who saw the St. Patrick Electric men on site, physical evidence that the fire was arson, and documents that show the connection to Harrington. What do we do now? Now we go after Richard Thompson, the owner of St. Patrick Electric. If we can find him and he agrees to testify about what really happened, we'll have a solid case." "Do you think he'll talk?" "It depends. If he was just a pawn in Harrington's scheme, he might be willing to cooperate in exchange for protection." Brandon closed the laptop where he was typing his notes. "But first we need to find him. How are we going to do that?" "I have a private investigator who works with me on difficult cases. I'll ask him to locate Richard Thompson." That night, Margaret had trouble sleeping. The day's revelations had deeply stirred her emotions. On one hand, she was happy to discover her suspicion of being framed was real. On the other hand, she was furious to know she had lost 26 years of her life to pure greed. The next morning, Brandon received a call from the private investigator. "Did they find Richard Thompson?" asked Margaret, anxious. "Yes and no," replied Brandon after hanging up the phone. "He is alive and lives in a small town in the interior of Los Angeles. But there's a problem." "What problem?" "He has been admitted to a psychiatric hospital for 3 years. He suffered a severe nervous breakdown and hasn't spoken to anyone since." Margaret felt a pang of discouragement. "Does that mean we can't get his testimony?" "Not necessarily. We'll go there and try to talk to him. Sometimes confronting someone with evidence from the past can provoke a reaction." They drove to the city of Riverside, where the psychiatric hospital was located. During the trip, Brandon shared more details about what he had discovered about Harrington. He started his career as a real estate broker in the 90s, he explained. He was known for using unconventional methods to convince property owners to sell their land at low prices. What kind of methods? Psychological pressure, minor sabotage, sometimes even direct intimidation. Brandon passed a truck on the highway. "Your case wasn't the only one. I found at least 5 other accidental fires on properties he later acquired for a pittance. And why did no one ever report him? Because he was very clever. There were always several intermediaries between him and the criminal acts. And when the victims tried to question it, he offered generous settlements to buy their silence. Except in my case. In your case, it was different because you refused to accept any deal." He looked at her with admiration. "Even when the defense attorney suggested you accept a reduced sentence in exchange for confessing to the crime, you chose to go to trial." "Because I hadn't done anything wrong," said Margaret firmly. "I wasn't going to confess to a crime I didn't commit. That stubbornness of yours, which hurt your defense at the time, may now be the key to exposing Harrington." The psychiatric hospital in Riverside was an old complex, surrounded by well-kept gardens. The director, Dr. Helen Carter received them in her office with some suspicion. "Richard Thompson is a very delicate patient," she explained. "He hasn't uttered a word in 3 years. His family has given up visiting him." "Doctor, we understand the delicacy of the situation," said Brandon respectfully. "But we believe he may have crucial information about a crime that ruined Mrs. Margaret's life." The doctor studied Margaret with interest. "Were you a victim of some act committed by Richard Thompson?" "I was wrongfully convicted of a crime I believe was committed by people working for him," replied Margaret. "Even if he wanted to cooperate, I'm not sure he would be capable." The doctor consulted a file. "He suffered a severe nervous breakdown 3 years ago, right after he began being investigated for tax fraud." "Investigated by whom?" asked Brandon, paying attention. "The Internal Revenue Service. It seems there were serious irregularities in his company." She closed the file. "But you can try to talk to him. Sometimes the presence of people connected to the past can provoke some reaction." Richard Thompson was sitting in a wheelchair in the hospital garden, staring blankly at an artificial pond. He was a man of about 60 with greying hair and a completely empty expression on his face. "Richard," called Margaret softly, approaching the chair. He did not react. "My name is Margaret Foster. Do you remember me?" No reaction. Brandon joined her. "Richard, we're here about the daycare fire in 1998. Do you remember St. Patrick Electric?" For a moment, it seemed there was a slight contraction in Richard's facial muscles, but it might have been imagination. Margaret decided to try a more direct approach. "Richard, I know your company installed a faulty outlet in my house 2 days before the fire," she said, kneeling beside the chair. "I know you were hired by Richard Harrington to do it." This time the reaction was unmistakable. Richard flinched in his chair and his eyes darted quickly, as if he was trying to remember something. "He's reacting," whispered Brandon. "Richard, I spent 26 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit," continued Margaret, her voice catching. 26 years away from my family, my friends, my life, and all because of what you did." Tears began to stream from Richard's eyes, but he still didn't speak. "I know you weren't the mastermind of the plan," said Margaret gently. "I know you were just a worker trying to support your family, but I need you to help me prove my innocence." Richard opened and closed his mouth several times, as if struggling to form words. Harrin, he finally murmured, his voice hoarse from years of silence. "Harrington?" asked Brandon, stepping closer. "Richard Harrington asked you to do the job at Margaret's house." Richard gave a slight nod. "Did he threaten you?" asked Margaret. Another nod. "Did he threaten your family?" Richard began to cry more intensely and nodded again. "Richard, can you help us? Can you tell us what really happened?" pleaded Margaret. "Can't. He whispered. "He kills—" "Harrington kills people?" asked Brandon, alarmed. Richard looked around fearfully, as if Harrington could be hiding behind a tree. "My brother," he murmured. "What happened to your brother?" "Accident. Wasn't an accident." The nurse approached, noticing Richard was becoming agitated. "I think that's enough for today," she said. "He's getting very nervous." "Please, just a few more minutes," Brandon pleaded. "Richard, where can we find evidence about what Harrington did?" Margaret asked quickly. "Old office, downtown, district," murmured Richard before the nurse wheeled his chair back inside the medical center. On the drive back to Los Angeles, Brandon and Margaret tried to process what they had discovered. "Do you believe Harrington actually had Richard's brother killed?" asked Margaret. "After everything we found, I wouldn't doubt anything," replied Brandon. "But our priority now is to find evidence at the old St. Patrick Electric office in the downtown district. After so many years, do you think anything could still be there? There's only one way to find out." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us as we're just starting out. Now continuing. The next morning they headed to the downtown district neighborhood, following the old address for St. Patrick Electric that Brandon had found in the company records. The location was a rundown commercial building with several empty rooms. The building superintendent, Mr. Jack, a man of about 70, greeted them suspiciously. "St. Patrick Electric closed over 20 years ago," he said. What do you want there? We're attorneys investigating an old case, explained Brandon, showing his State Bar Association card. Is it possible to visit the company's old office? You can go, but there's nothing there. It's been rented out several times since then. They went up to the 3rd floor where room 307 was located. The door was locked, but Mr. Jack had the keys. It's been empty for 6 months, he explained, opening the door. The last tenant was an accountant. The room was completely empty, with marks on the floor where furniture and equipment used to be. Margaret and Brandon walked through the space, searching for any trace of the past. There's something odd in that corner, observed Margaret, pointing to an area where the floor seemed to have been disturbed recently. They approached and saw that some of the wooden floorboards were loose. Mr. Jack, can I lift these boards? Asked Brandon. You can do whatever you want, as long as you leave everything as it was. Brandon managed to lift 2 boards and discovered a small space between the floor and the slab. Inside was a small rusty metal box. We found something, he said, pulling out the box. Inside the box were yellowed, damp documents, but still legible. It was a sort of personal archive with contracts, receipts, and handwritten notes. Margaret examined the papers, while Brandon illuminated them with his cell phone flashlight. Look at this, she pointed to a receipt. Special service, Foster Property, as per RM's instructions. RM for Richard Harrington, said Brandon, and look at the date, 3 days before the fire. There were other similar documents, all with cryptic notes about special services on properties that later suffered fires or other accidents. This is a treasure trove, murmured Brandon, photographing each document. Richard kept evidence of all the dirty work he did for Harrington. Why do you think he kept this? Probably as insurance. If Harrington tried to harm him, he could use these documents to defend himself. At the bottom of the box there was a handwritten letter. Margaret read it aloud. If anything happens to me, these documents prove that Richard Harrington forced my company to perform illegal work. He threatened my family and me on multiple occasions. The fire at Margaret Foster's daycare was planned by him. She is innocent. Harrington wanted to force the sale of the land. Forgive me, Margaret, for having taken part in this. Signed, Richard Thompson. Tears streamed down Margaret's eyes. She finally had definitive proof of her innocence. Brandon, is this enough to reopen my case? More than enough, he said, carefully storing all the documents. Let's go straight to the district attorney's office. In Prosecutor Anthony Williams's office, they presented all the evidence they had collected. The prosecutor, an experienced man in his 50s, examined each document carefully. This is truly impressive, he said after finishing his review. You've built a solid case against Harrington and obtained substantial proof of Mrs. Margaret's innocence. What happens now? Asked Margaret. Now we will formally initiate the review of your conviction and open a criminal investigation against Richard Harrington and his accomplices. The prosecutor leaned back in his chair. But I must warn you. Harrington is a very powerful man. He has excellent lawyers and political influence. Convicting him won't be easy. But we have solid evidence, protested Brandon. We have circumstantial evidence, corrected the prosecutor. The document handwritten by Richard Thompson is important, but he is mentally incapacitated. A good lawyer could challenge the validity of his testimony. And the other evidence? It's important, but Harrington will say he never ordered criminal acts, only hired legitimate electrical services from a company. It will be difficult to prove criminal intent. Margaret felt a wave of despair. Could it be that even with all that evidence, Harrington might escape justice? Mr. Anthony, what can we do to strengthen the case? Asked Brandon. We need more witnesses. Someone who worked directly with Harrington and can confirm that he ordered the criminal acts. The prosecutor picked up a file. I will open an official investigation, but you can continue looking for additional evidence. Leaving the district attorney's office, Margaret was discouraged. 26 years in prison, and it's still possible that man won't pay for what he did, she murmured. Don't give up yet, said Brandon, taking her hand. We will find more evidence. Harrington couldn't have acted alone all these years. There must be other people willing to testify. They spent the following weeks investigating other cases involving Harrington. Brandon used his contacts in the legal world to find lawyers who had faced the businessman in property disputes. One of the lawyers, attorney Maurice Anderson, had represented a family that lost their rural property under suspicious circumstances. Harrington always used the same method, explained Atisa Maurice. First, he would create problems on the property. Then he'd offer a ridiculous sum to buy it, claiming it was damaged and devalued. "Do you know anyone who worked directly for him back then?" asked Brandon. "Yes, I do. A man named Paul Henry Davis. He was a sort of enforcer for Harrington, responsible for carrying out the dirty work." "Where can we find him?" "Last I heard, he was working as security at a mall on the north side." Atisa Maurice wrote the name of the mall on a piece of paper. "But be careful, Paul can be dangerous." At the mall, they located Paul Henry working as head of security. He was a large, intimidating man, about 55, with scars on his face and muscular arms. "Paul Henry Davis?" asked Brandon, approaching him. "Who wants to know?" the man replied, suspicious. "We are lawyers investigating crimes committed by Richard Harrington. We know you worked for him." Paul's face changed immediately. He looked around to make sure no one was listening. "I don't talk about Harrington," he said quietly. "And you shouldn't be looking for trouble with him." "Why not?" asked Margaret. "Because people who mess with Harrington tend to disappear." Paul started to walk away. "My advice is to forget what you know and get on with your lives." "Paul, Mrs. Margaret spent 26 years in prison for a crime Harrington committed," insisted Brandon. "Don't you think she deserves justice?" Paul stopped and looked at Margaret more closely. "You're the woman from the daycare?" he asked. "I am," Margaret replied. Paul was silent for a few moments, clearly wrestling with his conscience. "Meet me in the parking lot in 2 hours," he said finally. "And come alone." 2 hours later, they waited for Paul in the nearly empty mall parking lot. When he appeared, he was visibly nervous. "I'll talk only once and then I never want to see you again," he said, constantly looking around. "Harrington hired me in 1998 to handle a problem in the East Village." "What kind of problem?" "A woman who didn't want to sell her land." Paul lit a cigarette with trembling hands. He said she needed to be convinced. "How?" asked Margaret, though she already feared the answer. "First we tried psychological pressure, anonymous phone calls, minor vandalism, but she wasn't intimidated." Paul took a deep drag. "Then Harrington decided to use more drastic methods." "The fire?" "I poured the gasoline myself in the back room of her house. Richard Thompson installed the faulty outlet to give an excuse for the fire." Paul threw the cigarette on the ground and stomped on it. "We never imagined there would be children there that night." Margaret felt her legs go weak. She was hearing the confession of the man who had destroyed her life. "When we found out you had been arrested for the fire, Harrington said it was for the best." Paul continued. "He said we now had the perfect scapegoat and that no one would question anything anymore." "Why are you telling this now?" asked Brandon. "Because I have cancer," Paul said simply. "The doctors gave me 6 months to live, and before I die I want to clear my conscience." "Will you agree to testify formally about this?" Paul hesitated. "Harrington still has a lot of power. Even with cancer, I'm afraid of what he might do to my family." "We can get protection for you and your family," promised Brandon. "How do I know I can trust you?" "Because we're the only ones who can ensure Harrington finally pays for his crimes," said Margaret. "And because you know it's the right thing to do." Paul was silent for a few moments, looking at Margaret. "All right," he said finally. "I'll testify, but I want full protection for my wife and my daughter. I'll personally guarantee it," promised Brandon. A week later, Paul Henry Davis gave a formal statement at the district attorney's office, confessing in detail his involvement in the arson of Margaret's daycare and other crimes ordered by Harrington. With this new evidence, prosecutor Anthony Williams obtained a temporary arrest warrant against Richard Harrington. The businessman's arrest caused a tremendous media impact. Harrington was a well-known figure in Los Angeles society, a regular at charity events, and a friend of influential politicians. The news that he had been arrested for running a criminal organization dedicated to defrauding real estate deals occupied the front pages of all the newspapers. Margaret watched on the hotel television the images of Harrington being led handcuffed from his mansion in Beverly Hills. He was a man of about 60, well-dressed and with an expression of indignation. "How are you feeling?" asked Brandon, sitting next to her on the sofa. Relieved, she replied, but also confused. All these years I dreamed of this moment, but now that it's here, I'm not sure what to feel. That's normal. You went through a huge trauma. It will take time to process everything. On television, the reporter announced that the review of Margaret Foster's case had been unanimously approved by the court. Her conviction had been officially overturned, and she would receive compensation from the state for the years she spent unjustly imprisoned. "How much money will you get?" asked Brandon. The lawyer said it could be up to $5 million. Margaret turned off the television. "But it's not about the money. It's about getting my dignity back. What do you plan to do now?" Margaret stood up and walked to the window. Down below, the city life continued its normal pace. People going to work, children going to school, retirees walking in the parks. A normal life she hadn't had for 26 years. "I don't know," she admitted. "All these years I only thought about getting out of prison. I never planned what I would do afterward." "You're still relatively young. You have many years ahead." "I'll be 69 next month." She smiled sadly. "I don't know if that's young. My grandmother lived to 94 and was one of the most active people I knew." Brandon joined her at the window. "Life isn't over for you, Margaret. In fact, it's just beginning." A few weeks later, Harrington's trial began. The case attracted a lot of media and public attention. The courtroom was always packed with journalists and onlookers. Margaret attended every hearing, sitting in the front row on the prosecution's side. Seeing Harrington trying to defend himself against the charges gave her a strange feeling of justice being served. The businessman hired a team of very expensive lawyers who tried to discredit the witnesses and question the evidence. They argued that Harrington was a legitimate businessman who had been victimized by dishonest employees. But the evidence was very consistent. Paul Henry Davis detailed every crime he had committed under Harrington's orders. Richard Thompson, despite his mental limitations, managed to confirm some important facts. And the documents found in the old St. Patrick Electric office provided irrefutable documentary proof. During her own testimony, Margaret told her story with dignity and emotion. She described the 26 years she spent in prison, the lost opportunities, the destroyed relationships, the pain of being considered guilty of a crime she did not commit. "What hurts me the most," she said, looking directly at Harrington, "isn't even the years I lost in prison. It's knowing that someone was capable of destroying an innocent person's life out of pure selfishness and greed." Harrington looked her in the eyes for the first time during the entire trial. For a moment it seemed there was some regret in his expression, but he soon looked away. After 3 weeks of trial, the jury withdrew to deliberate. Margaret and Brandon waited in the courthouse hallway, nervous about the outcome. "What if the jury doesn't believe us?" asked Margaret. "They will believe us," said Brandon with confidence. "The evidence is very clear." After 2 hours, the jury returned with the verdict. "Guilty of forming a criminal organization, fraud, arson, and perjury," announced the foreperson. Margaret couldn't hold back her tears. After nearly 3 decades, she finally had justice. Harrington was sentenced to 22 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution to all the victims of his crimes, including Margaret. Leaving the courthouse, Margaret was surrounded by journalists wanting interviews. "How do you feel now that justice has been served?" asked a reporter. "I feel free," Margaret replied simply. "For the first time in 26 years, I feel truly free." "What do you plan to do now?" "Live," she smiled. "Just live." In the following months, Margaret received restitution from the state and additional compensation from Harrington's confiscated assets. It was more money than she had ever imagined having, but she knew no amount could compensate for the lost years. She decided to use part of the money to fulfill an old dream, to open a new daycare. But this time, it would be different. It would be a full community center, with daycare, tutoring, and activities for seniors. "Are you sure you want to go back to caring for children?" asked Brandon when she told him the plan. "I am," she replied with determination. "I won't let Harrington take that joy from me too. I love children, and I want to keep doing what I've always done best." Brandon decided to leave his law firm and join Margaret's project. Together, they bought a large plot of land in the Arts District and began building the Fresh Start Community Center. During construction, they received a visit from Anna Christine, one of the children who had been injured in the fire at the old daycare. Now she was a 33-year-old woman, married and a mother of 2. "Aunt Margaret, I always knew you were innocent," said Anna, hugging Margaret. "Even as a child, I knew you would never hurt anyone." "How is your life, Anna?" asked Margaret, moved to see one of her former children. "I'm well. I'm a teacher now," Anna smiled, "and I would like to work at your community center if you'll have me." "Of course I'll have you," exclaimed Margaret. "It would be an honor to have you on the team." The inauguration of the Fresh Start Community Center took place on a sunny Saturday morning. Hundreds of people attended, including many residents from Margaret's old neighborhood. Mrs. Evelyn, now 84 years old, was one of the first to arrive. "I always knew you would bounce back," she said, kissing Margaret's face. "You are a woman of strength." Susan, the daughter of the late Mr. Emmanuel, brought her 3 grandchildren to meet Aunt Margaret. "My mother always tells them how caring you were with children," she said. "They were eager to meet you." During the opening ceremony, Margaret gave an emotional speech. "This center is not just a place where children will play and learn," she told the gathered crowd. "It is a symbol that it is always possible for a fresh start, no matter how many times life knocks us down. I spent 26 years in prison for a crime I did not commit," she continued. "I could have come out of there bitter and full of anger, but I decided I wasn't going to let the injustice I suffered turn me into a bad person. This center is my way of showing the world that love always conquers hate, that kindness always triumphs over evil, and that it is never too late for a fresh start." The audience gave a standing ovation. Many people were moved, including journalists who had come to cover the event. Anna Christine joined Margaret on the makeshift stage. "I want everyone to know," said Anna, "that Aunt Margaret saved my life on the day of the fire. She risked her own life to pull me from that burning house. A person capable of that could never harm a child." Brandon also spoke, telling how the discovery of the truth about the fire had changed his life. "Margaret taught me that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always worth it," he said. "She could have given up so many times during those years of suffering, but she never gave up fighting for the truth." After the official ceremony, families began to explore the center's facilities. There were colorful rooms for the children, a community library, craft workshops for adults, and a special area for senior activities. Margaret walked through the rooms, seeing children playing and laughing. It was as if a cycle was being completed. After so many years of suffering, she was once again doing what she loved most, caring for children. "How are you feeling?" asked Brandon, joining her. "Complete," replied Margaret, smiling as she watched a little girl playing with a teddy bear. "For the first time in almost 3 decades, I feel complete. Do you think you've managed to overcome everything that happened?" "Overcome isn't the right word," she reflected. "What happened to me will always be a part of who I am. But I learned to transform the pain into something positive." "How so?" "Every child I care for now, every family I help, every smile I see in this center, all of that is my answer to Harrington and to everyone who tried to destroy me." She looked at him. "They tried to break me, but I became stronger. In the following months, the Fresh Start Community Center became a great success. Dozens of children attended the daycare and tutoring activities. The seniors in the area found in the center a place to socialize and stay active. And the professional training workshops helped young people and adults find better job opportunities. Margaret was finally living the life she had always dreamed of. Surrounded by children, making a difference in the community, surrounded by people who respected and admired her. One afternoon, she was organizing books in the library when she received an unexpected visit. It was Paul Henry, who had finished his chemotherapy treatment and was in remission from cancer. "How are you, Paul?" she asked, surprised but without hostility. "Better. The doctors said the cancer has significantly regressed." He seemed embarrassed. "I came here to thank you." "Thank me for what?" "For giving me the opportunity to do the right thing." Paul looked around the center. "When I testified against Harrington, it wasn't just to help you. It was to help myself too. I carried the guilt of what we did all these years. And now I can sleep in peace." He paused. "I know I can't undo the harm I did, But at least I managed to stop Harrington from continuing to harm other people. Paul, do you want to work here? Asked Margaret, surprising even herself with the offer. How so? We need security for the centre, someone to look after the safety of the children and the families who come here. She studied him carefully. Do you think you can look after children after everything that happened? Paul was moved by the proposal. Do you forgive me? He asked, his voice choked. I already have, replied Margaret. The day you decided to testify against Harrington, you redeemed yourself. Now it's time to use your second chance to do good. Paul accepted the job and became one of the most beloved people at the centre. His dedication to protecting the children was absolute, as if he were trying to make up for the harm he had done in the past. 2 years after the centre opened, Margaret was looking after a group of children in the park when she received a call from Brandon. Margaret, I need to give you some news, he said over the phone. What happened? Harrington died in prison, heart attack. Margaret was silent for a few moments, watching the children play in the park. How are you feeling? Asked Brandon. Sad, she replied, surprising even herself. Sad. Sad because he died without having the chance to redeem himself like Paul did. She sighed. Sad because a life was wasted by greed and pride. Don't you feel relief? A little, but mostly I feel pity. Harrington could have used his intelligence and resources to do good. Instead, he chose to destroy lives. In the end, the one who lost the most was himself. You're a very special person, Margaret, said Brandon. I don't know many people who would be capable of having compassion for someone who destroyed their life. I learned in prison that hatred only hurts us, she replied. I chose forgiveness, not for Harrington, but for myself, so I could live in peace. The following week, there was a small ceremony at the centre to celebrate its 2nd anniversary. Anna Christine had recently gotten married and brought her husband to meet Margaret. Aunt, I want you to meet Carlos, said Anna, introducing a friendly-looking man of about 35. Carlos, this is Aunt Margaret, who I'm always telling you about. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Margaret, said Carlos, shaking her hand. Anna always tells me how caring you were with her when she was a child. The pleasure is mine, Carlos, replied Margaret. Anna was always a special girl. Aunt, I have some news to share, said Anna, smiling. What news? I'm pregnant, announced Anna, beaming. And we want you to be the baby's godmother. Margaret was deeply moved. One of the children she had saved from the fire was now going to have her own child and wanted her to be the godmother. It would be an honor, she said, hugging Anna. A tremendous honor. And there's more, Anna continued. If it's a girl, we're going to name her Margaret, in your honor. Margaret couldn't hold back her tears. After so much suffering, life was giving her gifts she never imagined she would receive. A few weeks later, Margaret was working in her office at the centre when Brandon entered with a strange expression on his face. What happened? She asked, noticing his expression. I got a call from the lawyer handling Harrington's estate, he said, sitting down in front of her. What did she want? Harrington left a letter for you. Brandon took a sealed envelope from his pocket. She said it's to be delivered only to you. Margaret took the envelope with trembling hands. It was written, for Margaret Foster, in Harrington's careful handwriting. Do you want me to stay here while you read it? Asked Brandon. Please. She opened the envelope and pulled out a several-page letter. She began to read aloud. Dear Margaret Foster, I know you have every reason to hate me, and I will not try to justify what I did. My greed destroyed your life and the lives of many other innocent people. During these 2 years in prison, I've had a lot of time to think about my actions. I saw in the news the community center you opened and the children you are helping. I was surprised, but I shouldn't have been. A person capable of risking her own life to save children from a fire that I myself caused could never be capable of destroying other lives for money as I did. I do not expect your forgiveness, because I know I do not deserve it. But I want you to know that I acknowledge the injustice I caused and that I deeply regret it. As a small form of reparation, I am leaving all my remaining estate to your community center. It is approximately $12 million in assets and investments. Use this money to expand the work you are doing and help even more families. Perhaps this way, at least one good thing can come from all the destruction I caused. With respect and remorse, Richard Harrington Margaret finished reading the letter in silence. She was perplexed by Harrington's posthumous confession and the unexpected inheritance. "Will you accept the money?" asked Brandon. "I will," she replied without hesitation. "Not for Harrington's sake, but for the children and families I can help with this resource." "What do you plan to do with so much money?" "Expand the center. Create other centers in different neighborhoods of the city." Margaret's eyes began to shine with the possibilities. "Imagine how many children we can reach with $12 million. You really managed to turn something terrible into something good." "I learned that is the only way to overcome injustice," said Margaret, folding the letter carefully. "Not by letting it make us bitter, but by using it as fuel to do good." With Harrington's inheritance, Margaret's project expanded rapidly. In 2 years, she had opened 5 Fresh Start community centers in different regions of Los Angeles. Each center served hundreds of children and families, offering education, childcare, job training, and activities for seniors. Margaret, now 72 years old, remained active in the administration of the centers, but had delegated the daily operation to a team of qualified professionals, including Anna Christine, who had become the educational director of the project. Brandon had married a social worker who worked at one of the centers, and together they coordinated the expansion of the project to other cities in the interior of Los Angeles. On a fall afternoon, Margaret was sitting in the garden of the first center, watching the children play when she received a visit from a journalist who was writing a book about her story. "Mrs. Margaret, if you could go back in time and avoid everything that happened, would you do it?" asked the journalist. Margaret thought for a few moments before answering. "That is a difficult question," she said, watching a 5-year-old girl playing with dolls with her friends. "Of course I wish I hadn't lost 26 years of my life in prison. I wish I hadn't suffered all that pain and humiliation. But if I hadn't gone through all that, I might never have developed the strength and determination needed to create this project." She smiled. "Perhaps all these children we are helping today wouldn't have this opportunity. So was it worth it?" "Suffering is never worth it," Margaret replied wisely. "But what we do with suffering can be very worthwhile. Pain can destroy us or transform us into better people. I chose transformation." "What advice would you give to people facing injustices in their lives?" "Don't give up on the truth," she said firmly. "It may take a long time, it may seem impossible, but the truth always finds a way to come out. And when it does, do as I did. Use it to build something good." "And about forgiveness? How did you manage to forgive Harrington?" "Forgiveness isn't about the person who hurt us," explained Margaret. "It's about freeing our hearts from hatred and bitterness. I forgave Harrington not because he deserved it, but because I deserved to live in peace." A few months later, Anna Christine gave birth to a healthy baby girl who was baptized Margaret Christine. Margaret was chosen as the godmother and was deeply moved during the baptism ceremony. "Now you have a granddaughter of the heart," said Anna, placing the baby in Margaret's arms. "And what an honor this is," murmured Margaret, looking at the child's perfect little face. "I promise I will care for her as if she were my own granddaughter." Little Margaret grew up attending the community center and became like a real granddaughter to Margaret. She spent entire afternoons at the center, playing with the other children and helping Grandma Maggie with small tasks. On her 75th birthday, Margaret organized a large party at the main center. Hundreds of people attended, including many families who had been helped by the community centers. Paul Henry, now completely cured of cancer and remarried, gave an emotional speech. "Margaret taught me that it's never too late for a fresh start," he told the crowd. "She gave me a second chance when I least deserved it. And because of her, today I can look in the mirror and respect myself." Brandon also spoke, recalling the first time they met at the prison gates. "That day I thought I was going to help Margaret," he said, "but in truth, the one who was helped was me. She taught me that doing the right thing is worth more than any professional or financial success." Mrs. Evelyn, now 87 years old but still lucid and active, was one of the last to speak. I met Margaret when she was a young single mother trying to support her family with a small in-home daycare, she said in a firm voice. I saw her be wronged and humiliated, but I also saw her rise up stronger than ever. Today, at 87, I can say that Margaret Foster is the bravest person I have ever known in my entire life. At the end of the party, Margaret gave her own speech. When I left prison 7 years ago, I was lost, she said, looking at all the friendly faces around her. I didn't know how to start over. I didn't know if I could adapt to the world again. But I discovered I was not alone. I discovered there are good people willing to help. I discovered it's possible to transform pain into joy, injustice into justice, suffering into hope. Today, looking at all of you, at these happy children, at these families who have a safe place to leave their children, I can say my life has had purpose. Her voice broke. That all the suffering was worth it if it resulted in this. When I die, I want you to remember me not as the woman who was wronged, but as the woman who turned injustice into love, who turned pain into care, who turned 26 lost years into an entire life dedicated to doing good. The audience gave a standing ovation, many people crying with emotion. 2 weeks after the party, Margaret was at her home, a small, comfortable house she had bought near the First Centre, when she received a call from the hospital. Richard Thompson, the former electrician who had been admitted to the psychiatric hospital, had improved significantly and was asking to see her. Margaret travelled to Riverside with Brandon. Richard was much better, still fragile but lucid and communicative. Margaret, I need to ask for forgiveness, he said, holding her hands firmly. I destroyed your life out of cowardice and greed. Richard, you don't need to torment yourself, she replied kindly. You were a victim of Harrington as much as I was. He used your vulnerabilities against you. But I could have been brave. I could have reported him instead of agreeing to do those dirty jobs. You had a family to protect. You did what you thought was best at the time. Margaret squeezed his hands. What matters is that in the end you found the courage to speak the truth. How can you forgive me? I helped take 26 years of your life. Because holding a grudge would only hurt me, explained Margaret, and because I believe people can change and redeem themselves. Richard cried for several minutes, releasing years of accumulated guilt. When he calmed down, he asked, Is there any way I can help with what you're doing, with the community centres? You know how to work with electricity, don't you? Asked Margaret with a smile. It's what I've always done best. Then we have work for you when you leave here. We always need a good electrician to keep the centres running perfectly. 6 months later, Richard was medically discharged and joined the community centre's team. He worked tirelessly to ensure all electrical installations were impeccable and safe. It was as if he was trying to make up for every poorly installed wire from his past. At the end of the 8th year after her release, Margaret received an official letter from the Department of Justice. The federal government had decided to create a national community centre program based on the model she had developed. They wanted her consultation to implement the project across the country. Margaret, this is incredible, exclaimed Brandon when she told him the news. Your project is going to become national public policy. It's hard to believe, she said, still processing the information. A woman who left prison 8 years ago is now being consulted by the federal government. You deserve all the recognition. You turned your personal tragedy into a social revolution. Margaret decided to accept the invitation, but with one condition, that Paul Henry Davis and Richard Thompson also be included in the project as consultants. She argued that people who had made mistakes and managed to redeem themselves could offer valuable perspectives on prevention and social reintegration. The national project was launched 2 years later, with the goal of creating 1,000 community centres across the United States over the next 10 years. Margaret, now 77 years old, travelled the country guiding the implementation of new centres. In every city she visited, she told her story and inspired local communities to create their own social transformation projects. Her story had become a national symbol of overcoming and resilience. During one of these trips, to a small town in rural Colorado, Margaret met a young woman named Fiona, 25 years old, who had been unjustly imprisoned for drug trafficking and recently released after 3 years in prison. Mrs. Margaret, How did you manage to start over after so much time in prison? Asked Fiona, after a talk Margaret had given in the community. Day by day, Margaret answered honestly. Some days were easier, others harder, but I always remembered that I had a choice. I could let prison turn me into a bitter person, or I could use the experience to become stronger and more compassionate. I still feel a lot of anger, admitted Fiona. Anger at the people who falsely accused me, anger at the system that didn't protect me, anger at losing 3 years of my life. Anger is natural and even necessary for a time, said Margaret, but it can't become permanent. If it becomes permanent, it will consume your life like a cancer. How do I overcome the anger? By finding a purpose greater than it. Margaret looked into the young woman's eyes. When I started working with children again, the anger began to be replaced by joy. When I saw I could transform my pain into something that helped other people, the anger lost its power. Do you think I can do that too? I'm sure of it, replied Margaret with conviction. You're young, intelligent, and have so much to offer the world. The question is, what do you want to do with your second chance? Fiona became one of the first employees of the community centre being implemented in her town. 2 years later, she was coordinating a specific program to support young people who had been through the prison system. At 80 years old, Margaret was still active, though she had significantly reduced her travels. She spent most of her time at the original centre in Los Angeles, personally caring for some children and mentoring new staff. Little Margaret Christine, now 5 years old, was her constant companion. The girl had inherited her godmother's caring and determined personality, and dreamed of working with children when she grew up. "Grandma Maggie, why are some adults mean to children?" the girl asked one day while they played in the centre's garden. "Because sometimes adults forget what it's like to be a child," answered Margaret, helping the girl plant flower seedlings. "They forget the innocence, the purity, the ability to love unconditionally." "You never forgot, did you, Grandma?" "No, my dear, and you help me remember every day." Margaret kissed the girl's forehead. "You children are our hope. You remind us that the world can be a better place." On a December afternoon, exactly 10 years after her release, Margaret was organizing files in her office when she found an old folder with newspaper clippings about her case. There were sensationalist headlines from the time: "Woman accused of arson," "Daycare catches fire and owner is arrested," "Negligence or premeditated crime." There were also photos from the trial showing a much younger Margaret with black hair being led into court in handcuffs. Brandon entered the office and found her looking at the clippings. "Stirring up the past?" he asked. "Reflecting on the journey," she replied. 10 years ago I left prison with nothing, with no one, with no prospects. Look where we've come." She pointed out the window to the centre's courtyard, where dozens of children played happily under the supervision of loving teachers and caregivers. "Sometimes I wonder if all this isn't a dream," she murmured. "It's real," said Brandon, sitting beside her. "All this exists because a 68-year-old woman decided she wouldn't let injustice define her life." "We decided," corrected Margaret. "You were fundamental in all this, Brandon. Without you, I'd still be in prison. And without you, I'd just be a successful lawyer, with no greater purpose in life." He smiled. "We saved each other." They were interrupted by a commotion in the courtyard. Through the window, they saw Anna Christine running toward the administration building, carrying little Margaret in her arms. "What happened?" asked Margaret, worried, when Anna entered the office. "Nothing serious," said Anna, breathless. "Margaret just wanted to show you the drawing she made in art class." The girl, beaming, held up a sheet of paper with a colorful drawing. It was a happy family, an elderly woman with graying hair surrounded by many small children, all smiling and playing. "Look, Grandma Maggie, I drew you with all the kids from the centre," said the proud little girl. "It's beautiful, my dear," said Margaret, moved. "Is that how you see me?" "Yes. You're the grandma for all the children," replied the girl, hugging Margaret tightly. That night, alone in her home, Margaret looked at the girl's drawing again. It was a simple but powerful representation of how her life had been transformed. From a lonely and wronged woman, she had become the grandma to hundreds of children. She picked up a notebook and began to write her memoirs. She felt it was important to record her full story, not just for posterity, but mainly to inspire other people who might be facing injustice or hardship. She wrote for months, always at night, after returning from the center. She wrote about the years in prison, about discovering the truth, about building the community centers, about all the people she had met and helped along the journey. The book was published 2 years later, under the title Fresh Start: One Woman's Journey from Prison to Social Transformation. It quickly became a bestseller and was translated into several languages. With the book royalties, Margaret created an international foundation to support wronged women and social reintegration projects. The Fresh Start Foundation began operating in 12 countries, always with the goal of turning pain into hope. On her 85th birthday, Margaret was weak but still mentally lucid. The doctors had diagnosed a heart condition that significantly limited her activities. Family and friends organized a large celebration at the main center. Thousands of people attended, including many who had been helped by the projects over the years. Fiona, the young woman she had met in rural Colorado, who now ran a network of community centers in the region, gave an emotional speech. "Margaret Foster taught me that our greatest victory is not over the people who hurt us, but over ourselves," she said. "It's when we manage to turn our pain into compassion, our anger into love, our injustice into justice for others." Paul Henry, now over 70 and a grandfather to 5 grandchildren, also spoke. "Margaret gave me something I didn't know I needed. Forgiveness," he said, visibly moved. "Not just her forgiveness of me, but she taught me to forgive myself. That was the most valuable gift I've ever received." Richard, fully recovered and married again, told how Margaret had saved not only his sanity, but his soul. "When Margaret offered me work after all I did against her, I understood what unconditional love means," he said. "She turned my guilt into purpose, my regret into dedication." Brandon was the last to speak. "Margaret, you were so much more than a client or a friend," he said, fighting back tears. "You were my teacher. You taught me that success isn't measured by what we achieve for ourselves, but by what we manage to do for others. You taught me that true advocacy doesn't happen only in courtrooms, but in real life, day by day, when we defend the wronged and give a voice to the voiceless." Finally, it was Margaret's turn to speak. She stood up slowly, leaning on a cane, and looked at the gathered crowd. "My dear friends, if anyone had told me 25 years ago that I would be here today, surrounded by so many people I love and who love me, I wouldn't have believed it," she said, her voice still firm despite her age. "When I was in prison, I used to dream of this moment. Not exactly in this way, but I dreamed of the day when my innocence would be proven and I could return to caring for children. But reality surpassed all my dreams. Not only did I prove my innocence, but I transformed my experience into something that helped thousands of people. I not only returned to caring for children, but I helped create a national childcare network. If there is one lesson I've learned in all these years, it's that we are not victims of our circumstances. We are products of the choices we make in the face of circumstances. I could have chosen bitterness. I chose hope. I could have chosen isolation. I chose connection. I could have chosen revenge. I chose forgiveness. And each of those choices brought me here, to you, to this moment of deep gratitude and joy. When my time comes, and I know it won't be long now, I want you to remember me as proof that it is never too late to start fresh, never too late to choose love over hate, never too late to transform our pain into medicine for the world. Thank you for being part of this journey. Thank you for allowing me to care for your children, guide your families, and be part of your lives. You have made me the richest woman in the world, not in money, but in love, purpose, and meaning." The audience erupted in applause that lasted several minutes. Many people were crying, moved by Margaret's wisdom and gracefulness. After the celebration, Margaret spent her last months visiting the community centers one final time. She wanted to say goodbye personally to each team, each child, each family that had touched her life. Little Margaret Christine, now 10 years old, spent most of that time by her godmother's side, helping her with small tasks and being her constant companion. "Grandma Maggie, are you sad because you're going to die?" the girl asked one day, with the typical frankness of children. "I'm not sad, my dear," replied Margaret, stroking the girl's hair. "I am grateful. I had a long life and managed to do everything I wanted to do. But I'm going to miss you." "I'm going to miss you too," said Margaret, hugging the girl. "But do you know what will make me happy even when I'm no longer here?" "What?" "Knowing that you will continue to care for other children as I cared for you, that you will spread love and kindness wherever you go, that you will be a strong and courageous woman who makes a difference in the world." "I promise, Grandma," said the girl, sealing the commitment with a tight hug. Margaret Foster passed away peacefully on a spring morning at the age of 85, in her home, surrounded by Brandon, Anna Christine, and little Margaret. Her last words were, "Thank you for everything." The funeral was one of the largest Los Angeles had ever seen. People came from all over the United States and from several countries to pay their last respects. Children, youth, adults, and the elderly all wanted to say goodbye to the woman who had touched their lives in some way. The procession passed by the 5 community centers in Los Angeles, where children threw flowers on the coffin and sang the songs Margaret used to sing to them. At the cemetery, Anna Christine read a letter Margaret had written to be read after her death. "Dear friends, if you are hearing this letter, it means my journey in this world has come to an end. But do not be sad. I had a full and meaningful life, and I was able to leave knowing I left the world a little better than I found it. I want you to continue the work we began together, to care for the children, support the families, help those in need, to transform every pain into an opportunity for growth, every injustice into motivation, to fight for what is right. Always remember, we are not victims of our circumstances. We are the authors of our choices. And every choice we make has the power to change not only our own life, but also the lives of the people around us. I chose love. I chose forgiveness. I chose hope. And these choices gave me a rich and meaningful life, even after so much suffering. Make the same choices. Be agents of transformation. Be light in the darkness. Be hope for the hopeless. And when you feel discouraged or lost, remember the story of the woman who left prison at 68 and managed to build a national network of community centers. Remember that it's never too late for a fresh start. With all my love and gratitude, Margaret Foster. 5 years after Margaret's death, the Fresh Start Foundation had become one of the largest social assistance organizations in the world. The community centers operated in 50 countries, serving more than 1 million children and families. Young Margaret Christine, now 15, had become a youth activist, working on weekends at the centers and organizing human rights awareness campaigns at her school. Brandon, now 65, had become the executive director of the Fresh Start Foundation International and dedicated all his time to expanding the work started by Margaret. Paul Henry Davis and Richard Thompson continued working at the centers, now as social reintegration program coordinators, helping other people who had made mistakes find a path to redemption. Anna Christine had become a nationally respected educator, lecturing on innovative early childhood education methods based on the principles developed by Margaret. And in every community center, on the wall of the main entrance, there was a plaque with the phrase that became the organization's motto. It's never too late for a fresh start. It's never too late to choose love. It's never too late to transform our pain into medicine for the world. Margaret Foster, 1956-2041. The story of Margaret Foster had become legend, told and retold to inspire people all over the world who faced injustice, hardship, or simply needed motivation to start over. Her life had proven that a single person, armed only with courage, determination, and an infinite capacity to love, could truly change the world. 10 years after her death, in a special ceremony, the United States government created National Fresh Start Day on September 15th, Margaret Foster's birthday. The day would be dedicated to celebrating stories of overcoming adversity and inspiring people to transform their hardships into opportunities for growth and service to others. Margaret Christine, now a young adult of 25 and a graduate in education, gave the keynote speech at the ceremony establishing National Fresh Start Day. My godmother used to say that we are not victims of our circumstances, we are the authors of our choices, she said to a national audience. Today, as we institute this day in her honor, we are choosing to celebrate not only her story, but the potential for transformation that exists in each of us. Margaret Foster taught us that no matter how dark the night we are living through, we can always choose to believe that a new dawn is possible, and that when that dawn arrives, we can use it to illuminate not only our own path, but also the path of others who are still in the darkness. The ceremony was broadcast live to all community centers around the world, where thousands of children, youth, and adults gathered to celebrate the memory of the woman who had transformed her personal tragedy into global hope. On that day, in every community center, the children planted saplings of fruit trees, symbolizing how a seed of kindness, when planted with love and nurtured with dedication, can grow and bear fruit that feeds many people for generations. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of this story of overcoming and transformation. Do you believe it's possible to start over after great injustices like Margaret lived through? Leave your opinion in the comments about the human capacity to forgive and transform pain into love. Your reflection is very important to us. Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories of overcoming and hope.